On today's episode, it's 2 weeks on since Rachel Reeves' budget. What do the politics look like today?
We look at the latest from a non-existent Labour leadership contest.
And are there green shoots of a Tory recovery?
So, Kevin, let's get into it. 2 weeks on from Rachel Reeves' budget. We spoke last week about how broadly perceived positively by Labour MPs, broadly received well by the markets. We said then the public maybe not so much, but tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Labour land over the last fortnight.
Well, it's certainly in terms of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And remember, they were the audience priority number one. They're not really talking about it, which is broadly a good thing. So the Treasury are, well, they're pretty satisfied that the job has been done. You and I took you into Labour land yesterday. We were at lunch with the Chancellor. She looked pretty chipper. I was chatting to a Treasury Minister who remained unnamed, who said that they're all just pretty tired now after that budget and looking forward to a bit of a break. I think they look over the road at number 10 and think they've done their bit. It's up to number 10 now to carry on with the rest of the politics in the run into Christmas. So the Parliamentary Labour Party have been pretty much quelled on this issue for now. The politics has shifted more, as we'll talk about in a minute, to what's happening when it comes to leadership questions and legislation issues which aren't necessarily concerned directly with spending. Angela Rayner's been having a run out. She spoke for the first time last night in the Commons. So I think in terms of the politics, the budget has been put to bed. I think the Treasury ministers and advisors were pleased that there was no unravelling. We said last week, certainly this week, nothing's unravelled from the budget. You might disagree with it. That's a question of left or right, but it's certainly not an incompetent political budget, regardless of what you think of the economics. So I think in that regard, the Treasury and the Labour Party will be reasonably pleased with how things have gone. I think they're particularly pleased today, of course. The Deputy Governor of the Bank of England was in front of the Treasury Select Committee and said that they're now pricing in a reduction in inflation down to targeting on track for 2.5% by Easter because of the measures in the budget, and consequently, I think it's 90% likelihood as of today of a reduction in interest rates. Potentially there'll be 2 in a row. I think the Treasury then will be very pleased because then the budget will have met its objective of calming the waters, delivering Labour's fiscal promise, and also ultimately, regardless of many measures in the budget on individuals, most people benefit the most from reduced interest rates. They're a homeowner, and from reduced inflation, which of course impacts all of us because inflation erodes wealth more than any other measure.
It does feel like the budget crowded out any other conversation essentially between party conference and 2 weeks ago. There's a forward look to the May local elections next year and the elections in Wales and Scotland to just understand the impact that will have on the party politically. But there's this whole period in between now where actually we've moved on from the budget. What else can the government be working on? And we've seen a lot of discussion around things like the Employment Rights Bill being back on the scene. Angela Rayner made a brief comeback this week, didn't she, with a well-timed intervention?
That's right. Yes, Dan. Yeah, so she first, Angela Rayner, of course, since she was forced to resign as Deputy Leader and Deputy Prime Minister over the unpaid tax, or undeclared and therefore unpaid tax liability on her additional home on the South Coast, she has not appeared in the Commons since. She wasn't Labour Party conference, of course. She has been licking her wounds. She felt quite humiliated by the whole episode. She felt, despite public protestations of support by Keir Starmer and Number 10, she felt pretty hung out to dry by Number 10. And in fact, I was told that up until very recently, and indeed it might still be the case, that she doesn't take Keir Starmer's phone calls. But also people have been mentioning Angela Rayner. She's the princess across the water, if that's the feminisation of the phrase, in not just about a leadership contest for Labour, but just, a kind of a major symbol of the left of the party and also a major symbol of its relationship with the trade union movement. And particularly when there's been issues like around the Employment Rights Bill, around child poverty, there's been a sense amongst some in the Parliamentary Party, even maybe one or two in the cabinet, of thinking that voice has been missing round the table. And so she made her first speech last night in the Commons, or yesterday afternoon rather, which was on the Employment Rights Bill, where she gave a broadly positive, supportive speech to the government. Not entirely, however. She did warn against, I think she used the phrase, something like vested interests that would seek to water down further elements of the Employment Rights Bill. She's been particularly exercised by day one rights on dismissal, protection on dismissal being removed. You recall that was raised from a year under the last Labour government to 2 years by the coalition. And the Labour manifesto policy and indeed the Employment Rights Bill draft that was drafted in a record 100 days, pledged to bring that down to zero. But in order to get the bill through the House of Lords, the government has settled on 6 months. Angela is said to not be overly happy with that, and some other measures as well. So I think she's testing the water. She hasn't settled her tax bill yet, but apparently a resolution is on the table. So yes, it's significant that Angela Rayner has made her reappearance in the Commons. She's testing the water. She hasn't done any media. I think we'll see the baby steps there as well. She did appear at the Tribune group of soft left Labour MPs when they last met, so she is still around. But her first public appearance in the Commons was just this week, and that's of course after Keir Starmer said in his Observer interview on Sunday that he thought that Angela should return to the cabinet.
And it does sort of tell you that, you know, a government with a majority of the size that it has, 15 months in, shouldn't really be worrying about necessarily the interventions of ministers who resigned in scandal recently. But clearly there is this overwhelming anxiety that is running across the top of the Labour Party at the moment in the leadership, because, as we said a month ago, when that warning shot to Wes Streeting was led by Number 10 and led BBC News and the Today Show and all the papers talking about a leadership contest, that it would be a matter of when, not if. And as a result, all of these interventions are seen through the prism of a Labour leadership contest, which, although everyone claims is non-existent, as we've seen, is very much in existence. So what's going on with that? Is Angela Rayner going to be the kingmaker, if you like, between these different potential candidates, and who's in the running?
Yeah, well, I think that there are lots of moving parts and various actors and interests when it comes to a potential Labour leadership contest. And as is often the case in politics, things aren't necessarily what they initially appear. Take Keir Starmer. You think, why would Keir Starmer in the Observer laud Angela Rayner and talk about how she should come back to the cabinet soon when she had to leave was only a matter of a couple of months ago due to, regardless of how you cut it, the failure to pay tax when she was in charge of housing. I mean, that's you'd think there'd be a longer road back. That's kind of like Peter Mandelson's return to government on warp speed. I think that's partly because those around Keir Starmer, including the Chief of Staff and others, see the route to stopping a potential leadership contest as scaring elements of the parliamentary party into seeing that if Keir Starmer goes, it'll be somebody like Angela Rayner or to the left, who the membership will elect as leader. So basically, they're thinking, how much worse could it get? Number 10 are basically signalling it could actually get a lot worse. Point one. Point two on this same kind of moves by those around the Prime Minister is there've been a number of messages going around the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is screen-grabbing comments made by fund managers and investment managers, not an obvious audience for Labour MPs to listen to, saying that a potential change in Labour leader could destabilise the markets and create a trust moment. As they say, cui bono. There's only one person that benefits from there not being a leadership contest, and that's the current incumbent of Number 10. And the third is chatter now, people saying, how long would a Labour leadership contest have to be? And one phrase that was used with me, how many Bank of England monetary policy meetings would take place in that period. So 8 weeks is a minimum. That was described to me as 2 potential Bank of England base rate cuts will be put on hold. So if that isn't digging in the bunker, I don't know what is. That's what's happening around the Prime Minister, which also means it is not inevitable as a leadership contest. But that's certainly the message is if you want to destabilise this government, this party, and therefore your chances of re-election, there's one surefire route is to get rid of the Prime Minister. So there's that camp there. There are others who are saying, of course, that it's all baked in, that actually the leadership contest already started. There's Labour Together, the organisation that was headed and founded by Morgan McSweeney and has had initial backers, including Siobhan Mood and others in the reading the cabinet. They have started polling Labour Party members on who they think could win the next general election and who they think should be in a leadership contest. That's quite a big signal to go out to the public with, to say the group that was the vehicle for Keir Starmer 20 Number 10 is now asking openly who should come next. I mean, if that isn't the start of a potential leadership contest, I don't know what is. And I think whoever commissioned that poll knew exactly what they were doing when it went into the public domain. And much more cynical minds than me have suggested that the previous chief executive of Labour Together, who's now Chief of Staff in Number 10, Morgan McSweeney, may well have been totally aware and instructive in this process, again, in order to start rolling the pitch on what might come next after Keir Starmer. If Morgan McSweeney is looking at a future in politics, I'm sure he's got a bright one ahead of him, even brighter than today. He may well think there are certain outcomes to that leadership contest which will be more favourable to him and his future than.
I mean, there is another way that doesn't involve a leadership contest at all, presumably, which is some sort of agreement between different factions to prevent those two monetary policy committees from even taking place, because the contest wouldn't be 8 weeks. You install a new prime minister in a relatively painless way. Doesn't feel to me that's particularly likely, and not necessarily the Labour way, but would that be a way, do you think, for a couple of leadership contenders to team up, different wings of the party, do a deal, and be in number 10 and 11 respectively in the new year?
Well, I think that's certainly a scenario that has been discussed, I'm sure, by a number of potential actors and players, and indeed those advising them in the cabinet and outside, or currently outside. You're absolutely right. That doesn't feel like the Labour way, but what I've said to people, and many others in and around the party say, is also what's not usual is the Labour Party being in government. And when it's in government, what's not usual is staying in government. So if you don't want history to repeat itself, then you have to do something differently. There have been reports, if these are true, of course, that the likes of Wes Streeting and his people are talking to Angela Rayner about a potential deal, which would make a lot of sense for a coronation, because, of course, who'd complain about a coronation? Well, either the left or the right was saying it's a move to block them. Same with some elements of the trade union movement. You kind of cover off a lot of those arguments preemptively if you have a combination like Rayner and Streeting. And it has been suggested to me as well that part of number 10 bidding up Angela Rayner is in order to try and scupper any potential deal. Because at the moment, she still thinks she's in too weak a position to run for leader, it's been said. So, of course, number 10, big her up. They potentially scupper a deal because Angela, I'd imagine, would say if there is a deal, then she's the top of that ticket. So I think all bets are off. I think it is as likely that there's a deal and a coronation as it is likely there's no leadership contest at all. What is true and what everyone agrees on, and I think what people were saying this yesterday that I spoke to at lunch and around lunch, was it's still all about May. So losses in England in particular are baked in, and so nothing's really going to shift that, including on-the-ground campaigning, quite frankly. It'll make the difference in certain wards and councils, but the overall trend is clear. And as we get into the new year, as Parliament comes back after Christmas, I think if the polls hover where they are, I mean, we had today's YouGov Sky News, which is often the most accurate, I think, over the last few years, that had Reform on 27. It had Labour on, I think it was 19, and the Tories on 18. So if the polls are still in and around those levels, I do wonder if people will keep their powder dry before May. I suspect they will, because it'll be quite hard to turn those poll numbers around before the local elections will impact them. So I think for the Labour Party, at least, if there is any formal move, then it will be after the May local elections, if indeed it happens at all.
All eyes on May then, really.
Absolutely. And I guess all eyes on May on the other side of the House as well. I mean, tell me what the chat has been amongst the Tory parliamentary benches, because it certainly seems from the outside that Kemi Badenoch has had a bit of a rally, a bit of a resurgence since conference. She certainly seemed to enjoy herself at the budget, and we mustn't underestimate politicians enjoying themselves and the positive impact that has on their colleagues and on the polls.
I think that's right. There's no doubt that Kemi Badenoch has had a good autumn after a pretty terrible first half of the year. I think, just after the May elections, where, the Conservatives suffered really heavy losses across the board, really, there was lots of chatter about lack of policy, lack of a clear campaign, openly talking about when a leadership contest would take place. Would it be this side of Christmas? Lots of people talking about, again, waiting till after May, but lots of people then talking about pre-Christmas, installing Robert Jenrick, who was having these viral videos at the time, doing things like taking on fare dodgers and, really a decent social media game. That energized lots of Tory activists and Tory MPs. And, there was genuine chatter about replacing her pretty quickly. That all changed at party conference when I think Kemi delivered the speech that she needed to deliver. Certainly, it wasn't necessarily a speech to the country, but it was a very good speech to Conservative Party members, activists, backbenchers, people who had liked what she was saying when she was a leadership contender, liked what she was saying when she was in Kemi fighting mode as in the cabinet and in the parliamentary party, but hadn't really seen any of that since she became leader. So it started with her conference speech. I think that really reset things for her. And I think she's built on that to some extent over the autumn. The budget response was extremely good, so much to the point where there were viral videos going around. And I can always tell when something is starting to gain a bit of traction, because my sister, who's in no way political, starts sharing various clips with me, asking who this person is and whether or not they're somebody that she should consider voting for. I think definitely on the policy game, she's making well-timed interventions, responded well to the budget, and I think that she's doing those set piece parliamentary moments well. PMQs, we've definitely seen an improvement week by week as well. So overall, pretty good. You then layer on some of the more administrative things that, frankly, the party was in a pretty bad way after 14 years in government, suffering a huge defeat. It had very little money. There were lots of redundancies, big restructures happening internally. All of this stuff affects your ability to campaign effectively. What we have seen in the last few months is a new social media agency being appointed. They went out to consultancy, spent a significant sum of money, I'm told, on that tender. Lots of activists sharing a stat in WhatsApp groups over the last couple of days that the Conservative TikTok page has had the most reach of any political party in the UK over the last month or so. The party has also just, for the first time since 2000, bought their own building in central London. So raised enough money through the Conservative Endowment Fund, but basically raised enough money to actually have a permanent home that is owned by the Conservative Party again, rather than going lease to lease, as most political parties have had to do in recent years. And so there's some sort of administrative things that are happening, and candidate selections have also now started. So there's lots of people who are starting to think about the prospect of standing for election again and running a campaign. So I'd say, psychologically, the party is in a much better place. Kemi is performing much better. Now, okay, that's great, but what impact is that having on the real world in terms of polls and election results? What I think Kemi has been able to do in recent months is stem the tide, where, essentially from the start of her leadership to May, June, July this year, hemorrhaging votes to reform more than anyone, lots of the Lib Dems as well, but hemorrhaging votes. The Conservative poll ratings seem to just go down and down on a weekly basis from election to election. So what's happened in the last 6, 7, 8 weeks is a turnaround. It's not going up at a particularly fast rate, but it is going up a little bit. Reform's poll rating slightly down if you take the average of all the polls. But again, it's not significant moves. But I think it is a sign that people are saying, well, look, we're not convinced yet, but we're not abandoning the party anymore. We're just letting it plateau for a bit and seeing where things go. And I think, frankly, given the context of Kemi taking on the leadership and where she was 6 months ago, she'll be very happy with that as a Christmas present.
Yeah, I'm sure, and it's certainly the case that, it's odd because it feels like the shine's coming off reform a bit, and I think you're right. The kind of polls would have them down a little bit, but they're still way in front of Labour and then the Conservatives, who are both kind of bunching together. So I guess we won't know, as politicians always say, the only poll that matters is on polling day itself. Absolutely. And we're going to have 6 months or 5 and a bit months to run. Well, 6 months almost exactly to run on that. I do wonder if the personal challenge that Nigel Farage has had around accusations about how he behaved at school, his potential accounting for his election expenses in Clacton, whether or not all of that is just baked in, a bit like it was with Boris Johnson, definitely the way it is with Donald Trump, or whether that might have some sort of downward drag on Reform's poll numbers.
I think the danger with that is that Farage try and emulate the Trump playbook effectively. Farage and Reform, they try and emulate that Trump playbook of, this is a coordinated media witch hunt against somebody who's gaining traction in the polls. It plays into the establishment versus Nigel on the side of the little guy sort of narrative. I think that you can already see signs that Reform are leaning into that. In a British context, it remains to be seen how electorally successful that's going to be. But I would be very surprised if Reform don't continue on that trajectory, because it may well just be the thing that they need to keep their poll ratings where they are. But again, it feels to me that we're heading to 2026 with a bit of a plateauing of where the parties are poll-wise, and the real test being next May as the thing that's going to shift everything on a gear. But we will see.
Absolutely. Well, as we head into Christmas, we've got one more episode this year to go of political business, and still a lot more politics to go relevant to business before the end of term, basically the end of next week. But as we wrap up for today, we'd like to, of course, have the 3 Takeaways. So, what are our 3 takeaways from today?
Yeah, the first is don't be so obsessed with those political and parliamentary moments. The budget was one event in a 5-year parliament. And as we've said all along, Labour will be in power until 2029.
And secondly, there'll be ongoing speculation. It'll reach fever pitch in 2026 on the Labour leadership. So when looking at all the press reports and listening to podcasts like ours and others, always ask yourself, cui bono, who benefits from this briefing?
And finally, don't write off the Conservatives or indeed any of the other parties. We're now in an era of 5-party politics, and that requires politically resilient advice. You know where to come to get it.